Greetings, chess players. My name is Chris Torres, and this is Daily Chess Musings special coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi. Game 2 of the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match was a tense struggle which ended in a draw. Magnus Carlsen had white and chose an early rare move in the Catalan. However, his plan nearly backfired after the world champion made a costly mistake. Just when it looked like Ian Nepomniachtchi might win Game 2, he also played inaccurately, meaning the second game of the FIDE World Championship had plenty of drama and surprises. Now, without further ado, let's take a close look at Game 2 of the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match.
In Game 2, Magnus Carlsen is white, and he starts with 1d4. Ian Nepomniachtchi responds with knight to f6. Carlsen plays 2c4. Black plays 3e6. 3 knight f3. Nepomniachtchi gets a pawn in the center with 3d5. 4g3. So we're heading into the Catalan. Bishop e7, preparing a path to castle. 5, bishop g2. And Ian castles. And so does Magnus. So Magnus has chosen the Catalan opening, which uses the combined structures of the reti and the Queen's Gambit. Ian plays 6 dxc4. And Magnus Carlsen plays 7 queen to c2, typical for an open Catalan where white can attempt to regain the pawn. Ian plays 7 b5, of course to defend the pawn on c4, which is the main line. Some other lines to know about include, after 7 queen c2, 7 a6. Then white plays a4. Black plays bishop to d7, 9 queen takes c4, and bishop c6 was played in Roger Marcus versus Magnus Carlsen in Dubai in 2014. Magnus Carlsen won that game, and you can see it in the notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. Another line of interest after 7a6 is again 8a4, bishop d7, queen takes c4, bishop c6, and then 10 knight b to d7, knight c3, h6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6. And this occurred in Anish Giri versus Ian Nepomniachtchi, played during the Chessable Masters on June 21st, 2020. And again, you can see that entire game in the notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. And I don't want to get too bogged down with opening variations, but I know a lot of viewers maybe are not as familiar with the Catalan, so we'll look at one more possibility, and that is after 7 queen c2 as played in today's game, black could respond with 7 c5, immediately creating some tension in the center. 8 dxc5, bishop takes c5, and then queen takes c4, regaining the pawn. And that was played in Maxime Vachier-Legras versus Jeffrey Zhang in 2017. And as with the other two variations, you can see the entire game that Jeffrey Zhang won by visiting dailychessmusings.com and looking through the notes to this lesson. So back to our main game. Magnus plays 7 queen c2, threatening the c4 pawn, and Ian plays b5, defending it. And Magnus plays 8 knight e5. So Magnus has advanced his knight to the e5 outpost, unleashing a discovered attack on black's a8 rook. Previously, this early knight excursion was considered premature. So the main line for white was actually playing 8a4 to undermine black's defense of c4. And if white does play 8a4, and I like the move, black can play bishop b7, getting their bishop on the long diagonal. White can play ax b5. Black can play a6, threatening b5. Knight to c3, ax b5, rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, knight takes b5, bishop to d5, again defending c4, bishop f4, hitting c7 twice. So c7 moves to c5, dx c5, queen a5, knight c3, queen takes c5, rook c1, rook c8, knight takes d5, and knight takes d5. So that's a little taste of what to expect if white chooses to play 8a4. But Magnus chose 8 knight to e5, and this creates a problem for Jan to solve, which is the discovered threat on the a8 rook. So the main options here would be knight d5 or pawn c6, both of them clogging that diagonal. 8 c6. Blocking the threat with c6, and now black's queenside pawn structure is reminiscent of the Slav. I did, however, find one game of interest where black allows white's bishop to capture the a8 rook, and I thought that approach is rather fascinating. So here it is. 8 queen takes d4, bishop takes a8, queen takes e5, of course, bishop f4 threatening the queen, queen goes to h5, bishop comes back to f3, but then knight goes to g4, threatening checkmate. Bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, and black actually won this game between Sina Korvand and Khalid Syed Musavi, played in 2018 in the team championship for the Iran Super League. Fascinating stuff. And you can see that entire game in the notes to this lesson on dailychessmusings.com. And one more variation to look at would be blocking the bishop's threat on a8 with knight d5. And that is certainly fine. White can play a4 challenging b5. Black can play c6, and we get that Slav-style pawn structure again. And then white could play knight c3. And you can see a fine example of this variation played by Lenhard Biermann versus Dennis Scabs during the 2019 Dortmund IT Open. And of course, I also placed that game in my notes to this lesson. Because who knows, in many World Championship matches in the past, the contestants revisit a particular opening, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Catalan again in the 2021 FIDE World Chess Championship. But back to our feature game. Jan blocks the bishop's threat with 8c6. Certainly works, but that c6 pawn also makes it hard for black to develop the minor pieces on the queen side. 9a4. Attacking the b5 support for c4 by thrusting a pawn to a4 is a common theme in the Catalan. Jan plays 9 knight to d5. So now there are two obstacles between white's bishop and black's rook. Magnus responds with 10 knight c3, adding more pressure on b5. Also worthy of consideration is playing ax b5 immediately. But Magnus played 10 knight to c3, and Jan plays 10 pawn to f6. This will send white's knight away, but also weakens black's king safety and the e6 pawn. 11 knight f3 and 11 queen d7. Those playing black should strongly consider advancing the b5 pawn to b4 here. For example, if black plays b5 to b4, they're immediately threatening the knight on c3, which should retreat to d1. And then they can develop their bishop to a6, and white can develop their bishop to d2. And then black can play c5, so that group of 3 pawns is advancing. But white can play e4, temporarily having 2 pawns side by side in the center while attacking black's knight. But instead of moving the knight, black could play pawn to b3, threatening white's queen. Queen needs to move. Well, then the knight moves, but now it's on the b4 square. And white wouldn't like that, so they would capture. Bishop takes b4, cx b4. And now that poorly placed knight on d1 can move to e3. Black's queen can move to c8, supporting the pawn on c4. White could play d5, reaching across. But black plays c3. See how that formation of pawns just keeps moving forward. White can bring a knight over to help and threaten b3. But of course, that's allowing the bishop to take f1. To which white can respond, bishop takes f1, cx b2, and queen takes b2. And now without a pawn in the c-file, the pawn on b4 and b3 aren't as immediately threatening. In fact, white should be able to also win b3 in short order. So to me that looks like perhaps an improvement over what was played in the game, which was, again, queen d7, which is very pragmatic. It's defending the 2 weak pawns, but black's position remains very cramped. 12 e4. Carlsen gains a second center pawn, free of tempo because it's threatening the knight on d5. But as we saw in the last variation, black could play, and Nepo does, 12 knight b4. And obviously, that knight is threatening the queen, but it's really en route to d3. Magnus moves his queen to the best safe square with 13 queen e2. And as expected, Ian plays 13 knight d3. And now Magnus plays 14 e5. Ian will need to be extra careful about opening up the center, being that Magnus has much better development. So Ian plays 14 bishop b7. Not a square where the bishop has a lot of scope, but Ian realizes that catching up on development is priority number 1 for black right now. 15 ex f6, opening up the center a little bit and making things a little bit more dangerous on the king side for Ian. 15 bishop takes f6. Magnus plays 16 knight e4. And the knight on e4 has a lot of potential target squares. And Ian plays knight to a6, developing another piece unifying the rooks. And it's worth pointing out that capturing on d4 is being too greedy for black. White could play knight takes d4, queen takes d4, knight to g5, queen to d7, queen to e4, threatening mate. Rook to f5, blocking the threat of mate, and bishop e3. And Carlsen would have been very happy with his superior force at play, which is why, in our feature game, Ian plays knight a6 instead of capturing on d4. Magnus Carlsen plays 17 knight e5. And this is a mistake because black is able to capture that knight immediately, and we will see what results from that capture. So instead of 17 knight e5, so I propose that Magnus Carlsen should have played 17 knight takes f6, check, gx f6, bishop h6. Black's king is very vulnerable. Rook to f7, moving the rook to safety and securing the 7th rank. Knight e1, white's working on eliminating black's dangerous knight, but black can reinforce that knight. And then white could play knight takes d3, knight takes d3, and then 21 b3, undermining the knight's defense. Queen takes d4, bx c4, bx c4, but what's defending e6? Nothing. Queen takes e6, knight takes f2, bishop e3, taking away the double check threat. Queen to g4, queen d6, knight e4, queen f4, queen takes f4, rook takes f4, and f5. Black's pawn structure is a mess, while white is left with the bishop pair and slightly better chances. But in our feature game, white plays 17 knight e5, which is a mistake because Jan responds with bishop takes e5. Perhaps Carlsen didn't expect Jan to part with his bishop pair. So of course Magnus plays 18 dx e5. And now Jan brings his knight off the rim and into the action with 18 knight a to c5. And Magnus plays 19 knight to d6. Remarkably, both sides have knights in the 6th, which, if you're a fan of this channel, you know that placing your knight in the 6th rank is ideal, in a similar vein to how placing your rook in the 7th rank is usually very good. So both sides have knights in the 6th. Fun stuff. 19 knight to b3. But now Jan is guaranteed to win material. White plays 20 rook b1. Magnus very uncharacteristically makes another mistake. Better here, but still losing material, would have been 20 bishop to e3. And then knight takes a1, rook takes a1, a6. Bishop e4. Knight takes e5. Queen h5, threatening mate. Knight g6, stopping the threat of mate. Rook to d1, setting up some mean discovered attacks on black's queen. So queen c7, a5, rook a to b8, bishop a7, queen e7, bishop takes b8, rook takes b8, queen to c5, rook to d8. Lots of tactics here. Objectively, black still has the advantage. However, this would have been a better plan for Magnus. But Magnus played 20 rook b1, so another inaccuracy. Not a blunder, but still a mistake. Jan takes the bishop with 20 knight b takes c1, to which Magnus takes it back with 21 rook b takes c1, and then of course knight takes c1. And then 22 rook takes c1. And black's 22nd move is rook a to b8. Up the exchange, Jan is looking to put his extra rook to work in the b file. 23 rook d1. Magnus places his rook in the same file as his opponent's queen. Now the knight can move with a discovered attack, which of course is very dangerous for black. 23 bishop a8. Jan plays a nice move which keeps his bishop on the diagonal of interest, while improving the influence of his b8 rook. 24 bishop e4. Because of the discovered attack, Carlsen could have taken a free pawn with knight takes b5. However, he instead places his bishop where it takes aim at black's king. It's not hard to imagine white launching a kingside attack with queen h5 and maybe rook d4 with the idea of sliding it over. So black's 24th move is unfortunately c3. Now it's Nepo's turn to make a mistake. c3 is not even a useful distraction, as white can simply play knight takes b5 with a discovered threat, and then possibly knight takes c3, or just bxc3 to begin with. A very important improvement over Jan's 24 c3 would have been playing 24 queen e7. Then if Magnus launches his kingside attack with queen h5, black could play g5, defending the h7 pawn, bishop g2, rook b to d8, getting a rook in the open d file, queen h6, b4. Lots of action on both the king side and queen side. Bishop h3, obviously threatening e6, but black can ignore that threat by playing c3 now. bxc3, bxc3, rook to c1, king to h8, stepping out of the check. Queen takes e6, queen takes e6, bishop takes e6, rook b8, eyeing a possible rook to c2, which would combine forces on f2. Magnus can play rook takes c3, but it's very dangerous because black could play c5, which releases the energy of the bishop, and in fact is threatening checkmate. So white's rook would have to return directly back to c1. I like black's position here. I think black wins from here. But Nepo, who is playing exceedingly fast during this portion of the chess game, played 24 c3. Magnus plays 25 queen c2, forming a queen and bishop battery, which obviously threatens h7. 25 g6 stops the threat but creates more open spaces around the king. Magnus plays 26 bx c3. And Jan plays 26 bx a4, opening up the b-file for his rook. But queen to g7 was actually the best move, and I'll show you why. So had black played 26 queen g7, it adds to the king's protection while threatening the important e5 pawn. White could defend that pawn with f4, but now black has some choices. They can threaten to create more trouble for white on the queen side with a5. However, I would have been very excited to see 27 g5 with excellent attacking chances for black. Wow, that would have been an exciting position, which I guarantee you both camps have looked at in their post-mortem. But Jan chose 26 bx a4. Then Magnus played 27 queen takes a4. And after Magnus takes this pawn, the position is roughly equal. Black may have more material, but white has a perfectly placed knight, as well as good piece placement on the rest of his pieces. Jan plays 27 rook f d8, and there's a plethora of pins at play. 28 rook to a1 forms a battery on a7. 28 c5. But Nepo finally releases the energy of his bishop onto the diagonal of contention. 29 queen c4. Magnus likes his attacking chances, so he doesn't go for the pawn capture because it would have also exchanged queens. 29 bishop takes e4. And 30 knight takes e4. With the big threat of knight f6, forking the king and queen. 30 king h8, Jan's king wisely steps aside. 31 knight d6, and Magnus's knight returns to the ideal outpost. 31 rook b6, Jan's preparing to coordinate his rooks into a b-file battery. 33 queen takes c5. After Magnus takes this pawn, equality is reached as his beautiful knight and extra pawn balance out against his second rook. 32, rook d to b8 as expected. 33, king g2. Magnus's king is actually looking to go to h3 where it cannot be checked. Black's 33rd move is a6, moving the pawn forward so the b6 rook can threaten Magnus's queen and the pawn behind it. Magnus plays 34 king h3, finding king safety on the unusual square of h3. 34 rook c6 as expected. Magnus plays 35 queen d4, saving the queen, defending c3. Jan plays 35 king g8, moving the king off the diagonal with Magnus's queen. 36 c4, obviously looking to go to c5 to add even more support to the e5 knight. Jan plays 36 queen c7, putting a stop to c5 for the moment. So Magnus plays 37 queen g4 with the obvious threat of e6, and black plays 37 rook takes d6. Nepo has finally had enough of the knight on d6 and takes it with the rook. So Magnus, of course, plays 38 ex d6, and Jan plays queen takes d6. And now Magnus plays 39 c5, which is a nice little tactic to win a pawn. And you'll see why in a moment. Jan plays 39, queen takes c5. Queen takes e6 check is what Magnus plays on move 40. Jan steps out of check with king g7. And now Magnus plays 41, rook takes a6, winning that pawn I spoke of earlier. Magnus has a slight advantage, but not really enough to win. 41, rook f8, threatening f2. And just so we cover all the bases, Jan could not have played 41, queen takes f2 without being severely punished by 42, queen e5, check, fork, winning the rook and the game. Which is why Jan played 41, rook f8. Magnus played 42, f4. And Black's 42nd move is queen f5, check. Being a pawn down, with less king safety, Jan is happy to exchange queens into a simple rook and pawn drawn endgame. 43, queen takes f5. Rook takes f5. A rook with 3 pawns against a rook with 2 pawns, with the pawns on the same side of the board, is a textbook drawing position. But Magnus keeps playing 44, rook a7 check, which is good because it gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more, perhaps. 44, king g8, stepping out of check. White's king advances to g4 on move 45. Black's rook moves further away from White's king, so it can check from a distance if needed. Magnus plays 46, rook to e7, and then 46, rook a5. 46, rook e5, creating a bridge for the White king to move forward. And Black doesn't want to give White a pass pawn by exchanging rooks, so Jan plays 47, rook a7. Magnus plays 48, h4. Jan's king can now move up to g7, and with his rook guarding the 7th rank, White won't be able to play rook e7 check. So Magnus plays 49, h5, to which Jan plays 49, king h6, blocking White's king from g5. So 50, king h4. Even the great Magnus Carlsen isn't strong enough to overpower a few hundred years of rook and pawn endgame theory. Black plays 50, rook a1. 51, g4. 51, rook h1 check. White's king has to move back to g3. 52, gx h5. Rook e6 check on move 53. King to g7. Magnus plays 54, g5, to which Jan responds with 54, rook g1 check. 55, king f2. Magnus's king has closed the distance between itself and Jan's rook, but is moved further away to assisting his pawns in advancing. Jan plays 55, rook a1, again moving his rook very far from the White king so it can check from a distance. 56, rook h6. 56, rook a4, threatening f4. Magnus plays 57, king f3, to which Jan plays 57, rook a3, checking from a distance. 58, king f2, and 58, rook a4, repeats the position. And the players agree to a draw in Game 2 of the 2021 FIDE World Chess Championship Match.
I really hope you enjoyed today's special presentation of Round 2 from the FIDE World Championship Match between Magnus Carlsen and Ian Nepomniachtchi. For more on the match, please visit the official website at FIDEWorldChampionship.com. Additionally, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my Daily Chess Musings YouTube channel. Finally, be sure to check out dailychessmusings.com to find my notes to this video as well as thousands of other free learning resources. My name is Chris Torres, and I will see you tomorrow with a special presentation of round 3 from the Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi match.